Well, pretty lively scenes here at the moment. The police have just begun to arrest the last protesters, the diehards, if you like, 150 or so who had sat down on the ground, were refusing to move, and the police have formed a long line, sort of barricades on each side, and they are walking in and picking people up and carrying them off to buses. But the truth is, this is really a protest movement that has been vanquished not by force, but by fatigue. It's kind of run out of steam. There are only a few hundred protesters left here, and I think the police will have this space clear within a matter of hours.
And they will have achieved nothing.
No, and that's partly the reason why numbers have dwindled to the low hundreds now, from a peak of tens of thousands at the beginning. This was a protest movement about trying to win greater democracy from China's ruling Communist Party. The protesters were angered by the insistence of Beijing that it wanted to continue to wield this power of veto over who could stand for election in Hong Kong. Despite 2.5 months of blockades and sit-downs and occupations and sporadic outbreaks of violence, the Communist Party has held firm. It's stared these protests down, and it has offered them absolutely nothing in the way of concessions.
John Sudworth in Hong Kong, thanks.
It is now 9:15. The Royal Society, which is made up of many of the world's most distinguished scientists, has published a short guide to climate science to help people challenge claims about global warming made by what the Royal Society calls the ill-informed pub bore, or the family know-it-all. So, ever willing, Zoe Conway's gone to a pub to find out what the regulars make of it.
The Royal Society say they've produced this guide so that when people get involved in arguments about climate change with family members or pub bores, they're armed with the facts. Well, where better to try it out than the Boar's Head Inn in Crowborough, East Sussex.
You can have a word with the Chinese, Frank, and sort them out, can you?
At the bar of this 17th century pub, Martin and Frank are arguing about what to do about carbon emissions. With them are Ian, John and Bernard. Behind the bar is Jill, and I've come armed with the Royal Society Guide. So, the first question is the climate warming?
Yes.
By how much?
I would have thought less than 1 degree per annum.
Per annum? 10 years? Probably not.
You don't think it's warming?
No.
In answer to that question, the guide says, yes, it is warming. It's warmed 0.8 degrees centigrade since 1900.
So that's in 100 years. You're way out, Hall.
But what about this idea that they say that they are very confident that it will warm further over the coming century? They're talking about a 2.6 to 4.8 degrees centigrade rise by the end of the 21st century.
Doesn't surprise me at all. It's exactly what I would expect, bearing in mind what the Chinese are going to be burning in the next 20 or 30 years.
I mean, when the Royal Society say this, do you believe them?
No. Definitely not.
Why not?
Because it hasn't happened over the last 100 years. Why should it alter that much over the next 100?
Does it not make any difference that they're scientists?
No, I don't think it does make any difference as scientists.
You don't trust them any more than somebody you meet in the pub to judge this?
Correct.
This is another question. Is, does the rate of warming vary from one decade to another? And they say yes, it does, but that doesn't contradict the long-term warming trend.
It doesn't, but the planet gets warmer and colder in cycles. How much this is due to people driving diesel cars is another matter entirely.
Do you think you might read this guide?
No. Where do they get all these figures from? How can they actually prove all these figures?
Bernard, what do you think about this guide?
People are getting paid to produce these reports, and dependent on who it is that's paying the bill will depend on the slot.
I don't think anybody's paying the Royal Society to produce such a report.
They must be getting funding from somewhere.
So, Frank, you're taking this guide away. Are you threatening to bring this back to the pub?
Absolutely. Got to try and convince these people to start doing things about supporting the argument to try and stop global warming.
Ian, what will you do if Frank brings this guide back in, like I've done?
Make sure I'm not here.
Fabulous. Zoe Conway, reporting there from the pub. 12 minutes to 9. Berlin's mayor, Klaus Wawereit, steps down today after 13 years in office. He's credited with having given the city an international reputation as poor but sexy, very different from the reputation of London. And the better for it, according to the architect David Chipperfield, who works in both London and Berlin. He's written in The Guardian that all the private money going into buildings in London has meant it now lacks a sense of culture and has given up the idea of a public realm where arts and creativity can flourish. Well, to consider whether he's right or not, I'm joined from Berlin by Wilfried Kuhn, who's an architect based in Berlin, known for his innovative designs. And here in the studio we're joined by Liza Fior, who works in London for the company MUF. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning. Wilfried Kuhn, is that how you feel about Berlin as a result of its buildings, that it may be poor but it is sexy?
Well, for sure, Berlin is behind economically compared to London, and there are obvious reasons for that. But it is a city of very many young people doing things that can be done low cost in a way, because rents are low, or still are low, rising now, and people just do their own thing. So it's very innovative in that sense.
But how does it reflect in the way that the buildings look in its architecture?
Well, architecture is a slow process, so it's not that everything looks like that in a moment, but I think that there's more space available. There are more empty spaces still. Abandoned buildings and so on have been always kind of the resources that young creative industries search for doing their own thing, and so in that sense Berlin has been a place of freedom and has not been so crowded and not been so business-like as London for sure has been for many, many years.
And there's no doubt, Liza Fior, if you look at the new buildings in London, it is very business-like, isn't it? I mean, there is private money going into buildings that, well, I don't know, is it unfair to suggest they don't add something to the public realm?
You have to work hard to add something, and we work with good, the bad and the ugly, and each of our developers will probably be able to recognise themselves with the commitment that we make to make something public within it. And we sometimes have to work with a degree, almost as double agents, because we're paid by the developer, but we're making the public realm. So
how interesting. So what, a client comes to you, they want to put something up, and you think that would be a horrible addition to what London is?
If we take the job, we take it with the belief that we can bring something to the table, but it cannot be left to the public sector alone, and it needs robust planners. But as the previous 2 clips back, there is not funding for local government, and if there are no planners to hold projects to account, or to, when you have a good development, you create a dialogue, and it's a dialogue which also makes space for campaigning citizens. And I suppose that's where I'd look for something to argue with David Chipperfield's article in the spirit of the Today programme. And I think what I'd argue is there is a public sphere in London. All over London, people are campaigning for the fabric of the city, for cheap workspace, for the relationship between buildings and their meanings. But sadly, they tend to do it at the very moment that developers are going to kill it. And we have some planners who, like a significant one, who said, all I do is try to make buildings less bad, which is hard to imagine. He was from the City of London, how the walkie-talkie could have been more bad. But there are other planners who are working to make that dialogue a similar one to the ones that exist in Berlin.
Okay, and Wilfried Kuhn, when you look at buildings, I mean, plenty of people could cite fabulous buildings that have been built with private money.
Well, of course, it's not we don't want to say that private or public is a contradiction. In Berlin, what David Chipperfield is arguing is that there's a lot of state, also of course state building museums and the like. And I think that this is not the only way to build public. We cannot rely just on the state. This is an old-fashioned way also of thinking. I also don't think that this is what David means. That the point is that we have to find the public realm within the private initiatives and private developments. Otherwise, we will have no future. So I think that the point is to, as Liza says, it's the same here. We have to engage in bringing private initiative into a direction that creates public space and keeps public possibilities within private developments. And also, I think it's very important to trust cooperative initiatives of people organizing themselves privately, but with aims that are not just private profit. And I think that in that sense we need new forms of social thinking in architecture.
Right, but Liza Fiore, you take issue with David Chipperfield's contention that private investments hold over new architecture in London is an absolutely terrible way of building a city.
No, I agree that you cannot just rely on private funding to create a public sphere.
Sure, but your argument is that it isn't like that because of the planners, because of the other people, because of companies like yours.
My argument is that perhaps too much of our creativity is collectively spent on making things as good as they can be, and but lastly, that there are public realms in London which we don't find in Berlin. For example, our museums themselves, which are public spaces funded publicly, where, unlike Berlin, you don't have to pay €12.
Rather neat point to end it on. Liza Fiore, Wilfried Kuhn, thank you both very much.
It's coming up to 5 to 9. There's an interesting finding from the Rosetta mission spacecraft that landed a probe on a comet last month. The spacecraft, of course, is very much still there, and it's sent us back some information with regard to water. Alan Fitzsimmons is an astronomer at Queen's University Belfast and is on the line. Good morning.
Good morning.
And the finding is what?
Well, the finding is that the ratio of the two types of water we find in this comet is not the same as we see in the Earth's oceans. And this tells us very clearly that they can't have had the same source when the solar system formed about 4.5 billion years ago.
So our water doesn't come from comets?
Well, certainly not this type of comet. The situation, as often occurs in science, is not completely clear-cut yet. There was a measurement made of another comet using the Herschel Space Observatory about 4 years ago. And on that comet, they seemed to detect a ratio of heavy water to normal water in that comet, the same as we see in the Earth's ocean. So everybody went, yeah, okay, so maybe our water does come from comets. But this exquisite measurement, it must be said, from the Rosetta spacecraft around Comet 67P, clearly shows that this comet, and comets like it, could not have delivered Earth's water.
Really could not, and it couldn't have been changed by some environmental factor in the process of coming to Earth and being on Earth.
No, that's the problem. This is what we call an isotopic value. We're looking at the weight of the nucleus of the hydrogen in the water molecules themselves, and in the Earth's oceans, about 1 in every 70,000 water molecules isn't normal water, but it's what we call this heavy water molecule. It's got an atom of deuterium in it rather than hydrogen.
It's fascinating. I thought water was just H2O. It does.
Well, for all intents and purposes, as I said, that's it. But as I said, 1 in 70,000 molecules is actually HDO, and that value is constant all over the Earth. And as we believe that Earth's water came here after it was formed, because the Earth was formed as a very hot and dry planet, we've been looking out there in the solar system for other bodies which have that same ratio of deuterium to hydrogen, the H2O to HDO. And it was hoped that comets would be it, but it's looking more and more unlikely now with these measurements from Rosetta.
If not comets, then what?
Well, interestingly enough, if you go to the asteroid belt, and we have samples of asteroids from the asteroid belt, of course, in our collections in research institutes and museums, in many of those we do see the same amount of, the same ratio of deuterium to hydrogen. However, generally asteroids are much more rocky than they are icy. And so if this is true, that Earth's water came to us from the outer asteroid belt, from icy asteroids, then we would have needed many more of them to collide with our Earth in the early history of our solar system to bring the water here than we would have had for comets.
Which I suppose is possible, isn't it?
It is possible. In fact, it's predicted by some current theories of planetary formation and how our solar system came to be and how it evolved in the first few hundreds of millions of years of existence. But it's always good to have those theories based in fact, and this is what Rosetta's doing for us. It's a beautiful measurement, and we couldn't have done it without going there.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other point, isn't it? The value of it, which is already huge, quite apart from it just being marvellous to look at, and the pictures, I suppose, that have come back as well. I mean, it is fascinating that this is a really important scientific piece of progress that has already come from the mission.
That's right, and of course it's only just starting. These measurements are from the first initial phase of the Rosetta orbiter being at the comet. We can now look forward to next year, the first results coming back from the Philae lander, which of course we all followed in the middle of November as it made the first ever landing on a comet, and we'll get back more information on these isotopic ratios from there, including the UK Ptolemy experiment, which is led by scientists at the Open University.
Fascinating, wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to us. Alan Fitzsimmons from Belfast.
And just let you know before we go, if you want to check out those ASMR weird videos, which are meant to make you feel relaxed and actually just can make you feel just a little bit weird, we'll be tweeting some this morning. Autonomous sensory meridian response, lots of strange versions online, which we'll be tweeting. That's it from us, our editors Purvi Patney and Terry O'Neill. From us all, have a very good morning.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. The number of people killed by drug-resistant superbugs could rise from hundreds of thousands a year to 10 million a year by 2050, according to a report commissioned by the government. The review on antimicrobial resistance also said a conservative estimate of the cost would be more than £60 trillion. The economist Jim O'Neill, who chaired the review, told the Today programme the response from China and India was crucial.
Whatever we do here in the UK, we aren't going to solve it on our own, so I've got to spend quite a bit of time with my friends in the big emerging world, particularly China and India. So now that we've got this report out, I want to spend more and more time trying to speak to policymakers there to make sure that their focus on this is aligned to the commonality of everybody around the world in trying to find a solution.
The Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls has said a Labour government would cut the deficit every year and would balance the books by 2020. He told the Today programme there would be tough but balanced spending cuts alongside an increase in the top rate of tax to 50%. The Conservatives said Labour's plan was to run deficits every year. Asking a child to send a sexual picture via the phone or the internet is to become a specific criminal offence under plans announced by the Prime Minister. The offence will carry a maximum punishment of 2 years in prison. It is already against the law for an adult to exchange explicit images with children. The former US Vice President Dick Cheney has said a Senate report that accused the CIA of torturing terror suspects was full of crap. Mr. Cheney said the US government did exactly what needed to be done in the aftermath of 9/11. Police have arrested 76 people during a protest at the Westfield shopping centre in West London. The group were protesting against the death of Eric Garner, who died while being arrested in July in New York. Scotland Yard said the arrest took place when a group outside the shopping centre tried to force their way in. BBC News.
Good morning. In 45 minutes we join the Queen of Fashion of the 1920s and 30s in our Book of the Week, Elsa Schiaparelli, a biography. Today, dressing Mae West. First on Radio 4, we join Melvyn Bragg with In Our Time.
Hello. What factors influence where and what an animal chooses to eat? Why do some animals mate for life, while others are promiscuous? Why do some species invest a lot of energy in producing a few offspring, while others produce young regularly throughout their lives? These are the kinds of questions asked in behavioural ecology, the part of zoology concerned with the study of animal behaviour. Behavioural ecology developed in the second half of the 20th century as a combination of Darwin's theory of natural selection, along with ideas drawn from game theory and the economics of consumer choice. Scientists had always been interested in why animals behave as they do, But before behavioural ecology, this area of science never got much beyond a collection of interesting anecdotes. Behavioural ecology gave them techniques for constructing rigorous mathematical models of how animals act under different circumstances and predicting how they will react if circumstances change. Proponents say it revolutionised our understanding of animals in their environments. With me to discuss behavioural ecology are Steve Jones, Emeritus Professor of Genetics at University College London, Rebecca Kilner, Professor of Evolutionary Biology at the University of Cambridge, and John Krebs, Principal of Jesus College and Professor of Zoology at the University of Oxford. Steve Jones, can you give us a summary of what behavioural ecology is and what the key ideas are?
Well, you've just more or less done my job for me, really. That summarises pretty well what it is. It's the scientific study of the interaction between animals and their environment in a wider sense, their food, their predators and prey, mates, offspring, all of which can be fitted into a fairly homogeneous way of thinking, often based on shared genes, often but not always based on shared genes. And that, as you say, that really did alter the nature of research into animal behaviour, because before that it had been, to use your phrase again, a series of anecdotes without any explanatory power. It was called ethology. And the classic weakness summarised for me by a famous experiment done with birds, where you give a bird an egg which is 3 times the size of its normal egg, and the bird really likes that egg. Okay. Now, why should that be? I think for all reasons possibly. But the answer to an ethologist was, they prefer big eggs. Now, that isn't an answer. I often think...
Why isn't it an answer?
Well, because they prefer, what do you mean they prefer? Why do they prefer big eggs? I often think that all biologists, I'm sure the 3 of us around this table, have a guilty secret, which is they started as bird watchers. And I started as a bird watcher, and I filled up the little ticks in my book. And it never crossed my mind to ask, why do ducks have very bright-coloured males and the females are brown, whereas swans, the sexes look just the same? Now, that's an interesting question, which we kind of know the answer to, and that's the kind of question that behavioural ecology asks.
So, ethology really was just some John Aubrey's diaries, really, was it?
Yes, oddly enough, I mean, a slightly distant analogy, ethology was a bit like modern genetics, where you find the gene for something and then you stopped. You've only just started. So I think, the shift from ethology to behavioural ecology, I think, has a much wider lesson for biology as a whole. You've got to ask interesting questions, not just make interesting observations.
Given the fact that the 3 of you are fanatical bird watchers, we've had fanatical bird watchers for centuries, why did it take so long to get to the idea that there could be a scientific framework of explanation for this?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, people did ask, why do barnacle geese disappear at certain times of year? And the answer was they turn into barnacles. Now that was now that wasn't a good answer, but it was a good question. We know that's not true. I'm not sure we yet know exactly why some birds migrate and some don't.
And I'm interested in the wonderful patterns in the sky that we see with starlings and so on. Was that again always anecdotal, or they're doing it because of X, rather than can we work out whether they're doing it according to the principles of Y?
I remember being told in school that those big flocks of starlings were called murmurations. Why they're called murmurations? But that was the answer. Oh, look, there's a murmuration of starlings. It has to do, if I remember rightly, with foraging, finding patches of food, and hunting as a group when food is patchy.
Not murmuring to each other, come along, we'll move along the way.
That we don't yet know.
It's possible, isn't it? Rebecca Kilner, can you tell us about Tinbergen's 4 questions, when they came in and why they were important?
So I think Tinbergen's 4 questions were essential in moving the study of animal behaviour beyond the kind of anecdote that Steve's just been talking about. And that's coupled with the idea that behaviour can be a trait, like an organ to which natural selection can be subjected, and therefore can evolve and can be an adaptation. These 2 ideas were generally essential for the development of behavioural ecology.
Sorry to interrupt, but could you give us a date?
Yes, 1963 was when Tinbergen set out his 4 questions.
And Tinbergen was just he was who, what?
Tinbergen was one of the forefathers of the study of animal behaviour. He received the Nobel Prize for inventing the scientific study of animal behaviour in the 70s, and he worked in Holland initially, and then he moved to work in Oxford later on in his career.
Right, sorry, back to what you told us about.
So he set out these 4 questions, which are four kinds of ways that we can start to begin to investigate animal behaviour. So imagine we're looking at some animal expressing a behaviour like a parent feeding chicks in the nest, for example. So we can ask 4 kinds of questions about that. First of all, we can ask a question of causation. So what's the physiological basis of that behaviour? What internally, to do with its nervous system, its hormones and so on, is guiding that behaviour? Secondly, we can ask a question to do with development. So how is that behaviour refined during the course of an individual's lifetime, for example? What's the origin of that behaviour? And then we can also begin to ask larger scale evolutionary questions of the behaviour. So we can say, to what extent does that behaviour owe its existence to the evolutionary history of the animal? So if we look at close relatives of this bird, do they exhibit similar kinds of behaviour simply by virtue of sharing a common ancestor evolutionarily? And then the 4th question is really the one that gave rise to behavioural ecology. And this is a question of function. And the question really is, for what purpose has this behaviour evolved? How does it function to promote an animal's fitness?
So you've got a grid. Well, you've got the square, anyway, the 4 points of the square, rectangle, it might be, never mind. But you take off with that last one. And why is it that became the basis or the starting trigger for behavioural ecology?
I think because of this insight that happened at the same time, which in fact Tinbergen set out in this paper where he elaborated the 4 questions, which is that behaviour can be a trait that's an adaptation. So just like any other part of an animal's body or its organ systems, it is subject to natural selection, and it has evolved for a purpose to promote, in Tinbergen's terms, the survival value of that animal.
So does this come into work being done by Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene, and so on?
Right, so the big question, if you set out the question, what is the fitness value of a behaviour, then you have to define what you mean by fitness. And so at that time there was a considerable debate about precisely what scientists meant when they talked about the fitness of a trait. And one set of people, led by Wynne Edwards, believed that you measure fitness by looking at groups. So traits exist for the good of the group or for the species. Tinbergen didn't believe this at all, and neither did David Lack, which is another ecologist working in Oxford at the same time. And they instead believed that the purpose of traits was to promote individual fitness. But then in 1963 there was quite a revolution, because this man called Bill Hamilton changed completely the way in which we think about the fitness of individuals. And he said that not only...
When we're saying fitness, I mean fit to survive.
Well, this is what I'm going to explain to you. So he said that we can measure the fitness of an individual by looking at the number of offspring it produces, but we should also look at the number of offspring that individual helps to produce in its relatives. So we're no longer looking at counting offspring. The accounting system for fitness now focuses on genes that are shared by individuals and genes that are shared by their relatives. So this brings us to the selfish gene idea of thinking about behaviour, because what it suggests is that natural selection favours genes who promote their self-interest by being passed on to the next generation. And that can be achieved either by being represented in descendant offspring or by being represented in the offspring of relatives.
And this, that became very important because of Richard Dawkins' ability to write a worldwide conversational point of change.
That's right. So the unit of selection moved from the group to the individual to the gene.
Can we go on from there, John Krebs? Another important step, and you were there with Dawkins, with the whole enigmatics, so 3 or 4 of you bringing this on. But the idea of innateness came up. Can you tell us how it came up and why it's so important?
Yes. Going back to what Steve said at the beginning about ethology before the birth of behavioural ecology in the, I suppose, early 70s through to the late 70s, Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz, who shared the Nobel Prize with Tinbergen in 1970,